They dragged my wife by her hair in broad daylight while I stood frozen on the porch holding a steaming mug of coffee. It was supposed to be a quiet Veterans Day morning, but instead, two oversized HOA security thugs were yanking Layla down the front steps like she was some criminal. One of them had his hand locked around her wrist, while the other grabbed a handful of her hair like he was in a bar fight. The neighbors stood across the street in silent horror, clutching their dogs and coffee mugs, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they didn't see. One woman gasped and yelled, but no one moved. And me, I was stunned until Layla twisted her neck, looked dead into the eyes of the one dragging her, and said in a voice colder than anything I'd ever heard from her, "Congratulations, you just assaulted a federal investigator from the Department of Justice." Then she pulled out her badge. I didn't even know she had a badge. To backtrack just a little, this all started over a flag. Just a simple 3-foot American flag we'd hung beside our porch to honor my father and Layla's uncle, both of whom served in the military. Our HOA had rules about decorations, but it said nothing about flag placement. Still, that morning, we got a knock on the door from the newly hired HOA head of security, a bulky guy named Trent, who looked like he'd been rejected from every reality cop show in the last decade. He wore sunglasses that were too tight for his face and a tactical vest with the words HOA Community Response stitched in bold across the chest, like he was about to breach a meth lab. He told Layla the flag had to come down. She refused. They argued. He radioed for backup like she was a domestic threat. Moments later, another guy showed up, equally large and equally dramatic. I stepped out on the porch right as things escalated. Layla told them they had no legal authority to enforce rules that didn't exist. Trent responded by saying she was being non-compliant and that he was going to remove the flag himself. She stepped in front of it. That's when the second guard grabbed her arm and tried to pull her away. She yelled. Trent grabbed her hair. The mug fell from my hand and shattered on the steps. I moved, but the second guard shoved me back and told me to stay out of it unless I wanted to spend the day in the precinct. The whole thing happened in under a minute, but felt like it lasted hours. And then came Layla's words. That one sentence. It didn't come with screaming or panic, just raw certainty and that badge. Trent froze. His buddy stepped back. I blinked hard, thinking I'd imagined it. But there it was, Department of Justice stamped right above her photo. The woman I married, who I thought worked a boring federal admin job downtown, was apparently a DOJ investigator. And not just any investigator either. Layla stood up, slowly brushed the dirt off her jacket, and looked both guards dead in the eyes. I suggest you both stop touching me before this becomes a federal offense. Trent muttered something and let go. The second one mumbled an apology before stepping back. The silence on the block was thick. A couple across the street who'd been filming on their phones quickly slipped back indoors. The woman who had shouted now looked like she was about to pass out. Layla adjusted her sleeves, calmly stepped past both men and picked up the flag that had fallen during the scuffle. Then she walked into the house like nothing had happened. I followed her in, completely stunned. I couldn't even form a sentence until she sat down at the dining table, opened her laptop, and started typing like it was just another Tuesday. "So you're a federal agent?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. "Investigator," she corrected. "For the DOJ Public Corruption Division." I blinked. "I thought you were in data analytics or something." She smiled for the first time all morning and said, "That's what I let people think." I sat across from her, trying to process the whiplash I just experienced. My wife was a secret government agent investigating corruption, and apparently now the HOA had just committed assault against her on camera in front of witnesses and neighbors and dogs. Layla picked up her phone and started making calls. Within minutes she had reached her handler, someone she called McAllister, and gave him the full rundown. There was a surprising lack of emotion in her voice. She reported it like she was reading a grocery list. Timeline. Subjects involved. Witnesses. Evidence. My name. Trent's name. HOA President Karen Grayson's name. Everything. She hung up and turned to me. "I'm going to need to escalate this quietly," she said. I've been watching this HOA for a while. This just gave me the perfect legal entry point. I was speechless. She got up, walked into our guest room, and returned with a locked metal briefcase. She placed it on the table, entered a code, and opened it, revealing files, photos, maps, and surveillance note. I felt like I was in one of those spy thrillers. "You've been investigating our neighborhood?" I asked slowly. She nodded. "Karen and her little board have been running this place like a private kingdom. Extorting residents, fabricating fines, manipulating board elections. But I needed something public to justify moving on them. Trent just gave it to me. For a second I just sat there watching her flipping through files like a machine. This wasn't my wife. This was someone else entirely." She looked up. "I know this is a lot, but if you let me do this my way we can take them all down." I nodded, still stunned, but also deeply impressed. I was married to a woman who could probably dismantle a criminal empire with a flash drive and a good coffee. That afternoon she filed the formal incident report and sent it to the DOJ. We kept the footage. I backed it up on 3 drives. Layla instructed me not to post it online yet. Not until the timing was right. She wanted to give them rope. Enough to let them keep digging. Enough for them to hang themselves. As for Trent and his buddy, they were placed on HOA administrative leave by the end of the day. Karen tried to call us later and leave a voicemail apologizing for the misunderstanding. Layla saved that voicemail and sent it straight to evidence. That night after dinner she quietly returned to her laptop and made a list. Not a grocery list. A target list. And at the top of it in all caps was one name: Karen Grayson. The next morning started off unusually quiet. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was about to go very wrong or very right, depending on which side of the fence you stood. Layla didn't sleep much. I could hear her clicking away at her keyboard until around 3 a.m., and when I finally got up, I found her in the kitchen with a mug of black coffee and a stack of folders already open. The flag was back up on the porch, fluttering gently in the breeze like a quiet declaration of war. She barely looked up when I walked in. "I've already spoken to McAllister again," she said. "They've greenlit the initial probe." I sat down across from her, still adjusting to the fact that my wife was now spearheading a federal investigation on the very neighborhood we were supposed to be peacefully living in. She slid a folder toward me. "It's time you knew what I've been working on." Inside were documents that didn't just suggest shady HOA practices. They screamed corruption. There were spreadsheets of inflated contractor invoices, emails between board members discussing how to deal with non-compliant residents, photos of Trent and the other guards following homeowners late at night, and even letters threatening liens over fabricated fines. What's worse were the personal stories. Layla had quietly interviewed over a dozen neighbors who were too afraid to speak out. One elderly couple said their rose garden was destroyed overnight after they refused to pay an unauthorized beautification fee. Another man claimed his security cameras were forcibly removed by HOA guards after he caught them entering his backyard without permission. I flipped through page after page, my stomach tightening. How had we missed all this? Layla leaned in and pointed at a list of names. "These people talk to me, but they're scared. They've been gaslighted, fined, and in some cases threatened. Karen keeps control through fear and fake authority. That's why she hired goons like Trent, to intimidate. The board isn't just power-hungry. They're running this place like a miniature cartel." She paused. "And now we finally have cause to hit back." I didn't need to ask what that meant. Layla had already filed the assault report, and her team at the DOJ was assembling a sting operation. But she wanted to make sure when the hammer dropped, it shattered everything. "They need to fall hard enough that no one tries something like this again," she said, her tone cold and methodical. "They humiliated me. They endangered this community. And now they've earned my full attention." Later that day, Layla made the first move. She left the house dressed in plain activewear and took a slow walk through the neighborhood. It looked casual, but I knew better. Her jacket was lined with hidden audio tech. She passed by several residents and struck up friendly conversations. Some were short and cautious. Others leaned in and whispered things they clearly had been holding in for months. By the time she returned, she had gathered hours of incriminating statements. That night, she sent the audio to her DOJ contact and wrote detailed note. Meanwhile, I kept checking out the window, expecting someone from the HOA to retaliate. But the street remained calm. Until the next day. Around noon, Trent's replacement showed up. Another guard, this one younger but just as smug, patrolled past our house twice and made sure to stare directly into our windows. Layla didn't even flinch. She took it as a sign that Karen was rattled. The message was clear. "We see you watching." Layla turned to me and said, "Good. Let them know they're being watched too." Later that afternoon, a certified letter from the HOA arrived. It claimed that Layla had violated community decorum by creating public disturbances and inciting anti-HOA sentiment. It was borderline laughable. It read like a tantrum written by someone realizing their control was slipping. She placed it carefully in an evidence sleeve and tucked it away. By evening, she was ready for the next step. We were sitting on the patio when she explained her plan. "They'll get sloppy if they think I'm just angry. But I'm not. I'm strategic. I want them to think I've backed off. That's when they'll overstep again. And we'll catch every move." She'd already sent encrypted files to her DOJ team with everything we had so far. Now the goal was to lure the HOA into exposing more, especially their private meetings and illegal enforcements. Layla had mapped out the HOA board's regular schedule. Karen usually hosted informal meetings on Fridays, often at her house, and only the inner circle was invited. That's where the real decisions were made. Layla wanted inside. She reached out to a woman named Rita, one of the newer board members who seemed uncomfortable with the direction things were going. After a subtle meeting at the local park, Layla convinced her to wear a recording device. Rita agreed, nervously but firmly. She had joined the board thinking she'd be helping with landscaping and noise complaints. What she saw instead were fabricated violations, stolen dues, and secret deals with overpriced contractors linked to Karen's cousin. Layla handed her a modified key fob with embedded audio tech. "Just be yourself," she told her. "Let them talk. They will. They always do when they think no one's watching." 2 nights later, Rita attended a board meeting. Layla and I sat at home, nervously listening through a scrambled live relay. It started off mundane: garden upkeep, pool maintenance. Then Karen's voice took over. They started discussing how to handle the DOJ woman, clearly referring to Layla. Karen suggested placing Layla under community behavioral review, a term that meant constant surveillance by guards. Another member joked about fining her for sidewalk crack. But then came the bombshell. Karen said she was considering hiring a private investigator to dig into Layla's background, just in case. One of the men asked what she'd do if Layla really was from the government. Karen scoffed and said, "We've got enough money to make that problem go away too." Layla froze. That line crossed into serious territory. Threats against federal agents weren't just stupid, they were criminal. She stopped the recording feed, wrote a full summary, and sent it to McAllister that night. The DOJ didn't need more justification now. They had enough to move forward. But Layla wasn't done yet. Not even close. The next morning, she met with another neighbor who'd remained quiet until now. A man named Glenn, former military and current accountant, who showed Layla spreadsheets he'd been collecting. They showed how HOA dues had mysteriously increased, but actual service expenses hadn't. Thousands of dollars were unaccounted for. Layla smiled when she saw the files. This was the financial fraud angle. The missing piece. She walked back into the house and said one thing to me. "By the end of this month, Karen's going to wish she'd stuck to gardening." The days that followed moved with eerie precision, like a chess game where Layla already knew every move her opponent would make. Karen and her remaining cronies on the HOA board were growing more reckless by the hour. The guard patrols intensified, walking slower past our windows, sometimes shining lights into the house late at night under the guise of routine perimeter sweeps. Layla didn't flinch. If anything, she got calmer. Her eyes sharpened, her voice quieter, and her steps more deliberate. She was preparing for something, and even I didn't know the full scope. All I knew was that we were now deep in the middle of a federal sting operation, and the neighborhood had no idea how close it was to imploding. Layla began every morning reviewing transcripts from the audio captured by Rita at the HOA meetings. The material was damning. Karen had created an inner circle of board members who all benefited from inflated kickbacks, trash removal contracts billed at 3 times the standard rate, landscaping projects that were never completed but always paid in full, and phony fines funneled into a hidden maintenance reserve that conveniently only Karen and the treasurer had access to. More than that, they actively planned tactics to intimidate or silence any homeowner who pushed back. One board member had even suggested staging noise complaints against a woman who spoke at a public forum last summer. That woman moved out 2 weeks later after her car was keyed and her fence mysteriously collapsed. Now it all made sense. But what Layla needed next wasn't just corruption. She needed to catch them actively obstructing justice. She needed evidence they knew they were being investigated and tried to interfere. That was the linchpin to turn this from just another crooked HOA into a full-blown federal prosecution. And that opportunity came faster than expected. Late one evening, Layla received a call from McAllister. He sounded tense, even through the static of the encrypted line. One of Karen's guards had been poking around a DOJ personnel database. Not officially, but through a third-party private data broker. They had tried to pull Layla's employment record. That wasn't just creepy, it was illegal. That same night, Layla drove downtown for a closed-door meeting at a secure location. She returned after midnight, didn't say a word, and went straight to the office. The next morning, she told me flatly they were sending in reinforcements. Not agents with badges and guns, not yet. That would come later. First, they were embedding 2 undercover operatives. One as a new homeowner and the other as a contractor. Their goal was to provoke the HOA into targeting them, all while recording every interaction. Layla had picked the perfect time. Karen was already on edge and looking for new enemies. 2 fresh faces would be easy prey. Within 3 days, the new homeowner had moved into a vacant house on the far end of the cul-de-sac. A woman in her 30s named Jessica, playing the role of a yoga instructor with non-standard taste in landscaping. Translation: she hung up colorful wind chimes and planted sunflowers in her front yard. Within hours, she got a warning letter. The contractor arrived the following morning, a guy named Pete, casually dressed with an old truck, pretending to renovate the gutters of one of the homes. Karen came storming over to him personally, questioning his permit, demanding his ID, and even threatening to call the sheriff. She was met with a smile and a wave. Every second of that conversation was recorded, including when she told him she could make permits disappear for the right price. That recording, along with several others, were sent back to the DOJ and uploaded to a secure portal. Layla was careful to maintain her usual routine. She still went on her morning walks, still waved to neighbors, still wore her casual smile. But under that calm surface, she was coordinating a precision takedown. She cross-referenced every transaction Karen approved with financial records Glenn had provided, highlighting misappropriated funds and tax violations. She built the case like an architect laying brick, layer by layer until the structure became undeniable. But just when we thought Karen couldn't spiral further, she did something no one saw coming. A printed notice was taped to our door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from a law firm. Karen had retained an attorney and was filing a formal complaint against Layla for intentional defamation of character and emotional harassment. It was a ridiculous document filled with vague accusations and legal threats that sounded more like gossip than law. But it revealed one thing very clearly: Karen was scared. She'd caught wind that something was building and was now throwing lawsuits like darts in a hurricane. Layla calmly placed the notice in a plastic sleeve and filed it under the label Obstruction, Attempt Number 1. She smiled and said, "Now they're really showing their hand." That weekend, the undercover contractor Pete called in with another development. He'd been approached by a different board member offering him an under-the-table gig to install surveillance cameras facing several homeowners' doors, ours included. No approval, no consent, just quiet installations under the guise of community safety. Layla's jaw tensed. That was it. Illegal surveillance, conspiracy to violate privacy, bribery, obstruction, all boxes now checked. The final piece came 2 days later when Karen scheduled a last-minute emergency HOA board meeting. Layla had Rita attend again with the hidden recorder. During the meeting, Karen explicitly said the following words: "We need to shut this woman down before she turns the whole neighborhood into a courtroom. If she thinks she can bring the government in here, she's dead wrong." That phrase was enough. McAllister called that night. They were pulling the trigger. A coordinated raid wasn't coming just yet, but DOJ attorneys were filing the preliminary indictments. Layla's sting operation had provided all the legal and criminal foundation they needed. Financial fraud, conspiracy to intimidate witnesses, obstruction of a federal investigation, abuse of authority, and private surveillance without consent. The hammer was about to fall, and Karen didn't even know how deep the hole she'd dug had gotten. Layla stood by the living room window that night, watching Trent's replacement walk past again. She didn't blink. The flag still hung proud above our porch, and her badge lay quietly in the drawer beside the coffee machine. I walked up behind her and asked if she was ready. She nodded without looking at me and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "They wanted a fight. They're getting the full weight of justice. And we haven't even started yet." The morning it all came crashing down didn't start with sirens. It started with lawnmowers. The ordinary sounds of suburban life hummed quietly outside our windows as Layla finished her coffee and reviewed the case timeline one final time. She wasn't in her usual hoodie and joggers. Today she wore a crisp collared shirt, plain slacks, and a calm expression that had all the intensity of a thundercloud waiting to break. McAllister had called her late the night before with the schedule. Arrest warrants were signed. Federal marshals were ready. The DOJ was about to flip the switch. Every name Layla had placed on her evidence wall was now tagged and targeted. Karen, the treasurer, the contractor cousin, and all 3 security guards including Trent. It was no longer an investigation. It was an execution of justice. We heard the first federal SUV roll up around 9 a.m. It didn't have any markings, but Layla knew it from the plate. She stood by the window as another one pulled up behind it. Then 2 unmarked sedans. And finally, the sheriff's department cruiser that had been briefed just hours earlier. The neighborhood hadn't stirred yet. Most people were still sipping coffee or checking email. They had no idea their HOA was about to be dismantled like a crooked casino in a Sting movie. Layla didn't say anything. She just tapped the kitchen counter twice, a habit I'd come to recognize as her version of game time. The first knock was at Karen's door. It wasn't a gentle one. The kind of knock that lets you know you have about 10 seconds before it becomes a battering ram. Layla watched through binoculars as Karen flung the door open in a robe, clearly still half asleep, and immediately began yelling. That lasted about 15 seconds before 2 marshals stepped inside and placed her in cuffs right on the front step. Her screams were audible even from where we stood. She kept demanding to speak to her lawyer and saying she was being targeted. The irony was thick enough to taste. Across the street, Trent was still in his car finishing a protein bar when 2 plainclothes agents approached. He reached for his badge but realized too late it meant nothing. They identified themselves, showed real credentials, and informed him he was being arrested for assault on a federal officer and conspiracy to obstruct justice. He actually tried to argue that he was just doing his job. One of the agents laughed and said, "Your job ended the minute you touched a DOJ agent's hair, pal." Handcuffs clicked. The neighborhood was fully awake now. Curtains twitched. Phones pointed. Someone yelled, "What's going on?" and someone else replied, "I think Karen's getting arrested." Within 10 minutes, 4 more residents were in cuffs. The treasurer, the vice president of the board, and 2 contractors, all implicated in the financial mismanagement scheme Layla had so methodically mapped out. She stepped outside around then, just as the marshals were escorting Karen toward a vehicle. Karen spotted her immediately and exploded in rage. "You did this," she shrieked. "You're not even supposed to be here. You're just a housewife." Layla walked slowly toward the sidewalk, stopped about 6 feet from the patrol car, and replied calmly, "I'm a federal investigator with the Department of Justice, and for the last 4 months I've been documenting every single illegal move you made. You're done." Karen was still yelling as they pushed her head down and closed the car door. Her voice was muffled now, and somehow that made it more satisfying. The marshals nodded to Layla as they drove off. Some neighbors came outside, cautiously approaching us. One of them, a retired firefighter named Joe, walked right up to Layla and said, "I knew something was off with that woman. I just never thought anyone would actually do something about it." Layla smiled slightly and shook his hand. "The truth is we all did something," she said. "You just didn't know I was writing it down." The DOJ issued a formal press release later that afternoon. It was short but explosive. It confirmed that a federal sting had uncovered widespread corruption, unlawful surveillance, financial fraud, and use of force by an unauthorized HOA security team. Multiple arrests had been made, and the investigation was ongoing. Local news vans were parked outside the gates within the hour. The HOA website was taken offline by nightfall. All official business was suspended pending court orders. And just like that, the empire Karen built collapsed. But Layla wasn't finished. There was still the matter of restitution. She worked quietly with a legal team from the DOJ's Civil Division to ensure that every resident fined under fraudulent conditions had their dues refunded. She pushed for court-ordered audits on the HOA's bank account. And when the full financial picture emerged, it was even worse than we thought. Karen had rerouted funds into a shell company owned by her cousin, used community dues to buy herself spa packages, and paid Trent and his goons under a private contract never disclosed to homeowners. The court froze every account linked to her within a week. The civil suits came next. Nearly 24 residents filed individual claims against the HOA and its former board members. Layla offered to provide supporting documentation for all of them. At one point she was delivering USB drives to lawyers like some vigilante librarian of justice. It wasn't long before the story hit national news. Not just because of the corruption, but because of the twist. The woman who brought down the HOA wasn't a whistleblower or an angry neighbor. She was a federal investigator who had been living right under their noses. What stunned people even more was how calculated the entire takedown had been. The footage, the transcripts, the undercover operatives. It all came together with the kind of precision most people assumed only happened in the movies. And in the middle of it all, Layla never once raised her voice, never threw a punch, never leaked a thing. She simply let the evidence speak. The new court-appointed administrator for the HOA reached out to Layla and personally thanked her for what she'd done. He was a retired judge who'd been tasked with restoring order. He said in all his years, he'd never seen a more comprehensive citizen-led case. The neighborhood began to change after that. Without Karen and her enforcers looming over everything, people started speaking to each other more. Yards got cleaned up not out of fear of fines, but out of genuine pride. Kids played in the park without being told they were violating noise policies. Someone even put up a community board where residents could share ideas instead of threat. And through all of it, Layla kept her distance, observing from the sidelines. She'd done her job. She wasn't looking for credit. But there was one final twist. A month after the arrests, Layla received a formal letter from the DOJ. It was an offer. Not just thanks or a commendation, it was a promotion. They wanted her to lead a new task force investigating HOA corruption nationwide. Apparently this wasn't an isolated case. There were more Karens out there. Layla read the letter 3 times before setting it down and saying just loud enough for me to hear there's still more work to do. And I knew then that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The calm after the storm didn't come in a single wave. It crept in slowly like fog lifting from a battlefield. The neighborhood that had once been tense and suffocating under Karen's thumb was now unrecognizable. Gone were the staged compliance patrols, and the overzealous guards with tactical vests pacing up and down the sidewalks. The mood was lighter. Children laughed louder, neighbors lingered longer during morning walks, and the threat of some ridiculous fine over lawn height or flag placement had vanished completely. Layla stood quietly on the porch one morning, watching a few residents gather near the small park that Karen used to monitor like a prison yard. Someone had started a community cleanup effort, all volunteer-based. No orders, no fees, just people doing things because they cared. And it made her smile. Not a broad grin, but the subtle, satisfied kind of smile that came when you knew your work had meant something. The former HOA board members were still battling their legal nightmares. Karen was denied bail after a judge determined she was a flight risk and still uncooperative with investigators. Her lawyers tried everything from medical excuses to claims of political targeting, but none of it stuck. Trent had tried to pivot, claiming he was just following orders, but his recorded threats and the physical assault on Layla made sure he wouldn't wriggle out easily. The court proceedings were expected to stretch for months, possibly even a year. Meanwhile, the new court-appointed HOA administrator had invited Layla to a neighborhood forum, not to be honored or celebrated, but to answer questions and help ensure transparency moving forward. She agreed under one condition: that it be open to all residents and fully recorded. The forum was held on a Sunday afternoon in the community clubhouse, which for once wasn't decked out in Karen's personal brand of manicured perfection. Folding chairs, open mics, honest discussion. Layla sat near the front and listened quietly as residents shared their frustrations, their confusion, and, more than anything, their gratitude. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with authority or force. She told them the truth, that justice isn't about punishment alone, it's about protection. That corruption grows when good people stay silent and fear replaces fairness. She didn't mention her badge once. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room already knew exactly who she was. Later that evening, Layla received a call from McAllister. The national task force she'd been offered was officially approved. They wanted her to lead it, to travel and train new agents on how to detect similar corruption in residential communities. It was uncharted territory for the DOJ, but after the success of her sting, it became clear there were too many neighborhoods across the country suffering under the same kind of small-scale tyranny. She didn't answer immediately. She let it sit. She'd given so much of herself to this neighborhood, quietly, relentlessly, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to step into the spotlight of a national initiative. But she also couldn't ignore how deep the rot went beyond just one zip code. I found her that night sitting on the porch swing with the task force offer letter on her lap. She looked tired, but not worn out, more like someone recovering from the final lap of a long race. I sat beside her and didn't say anything at first. She finally spoke after a few minutes. "I didn't expect it to get this big," she said. "I thought I was just helping a few people stand up to bullies." I nodded and said, "Sometimes that's all it takes. One match to light a fire. One woman with a badge and a backbone." She smirked. "You sound like a campaign slogan." I shrugged and replied, "Maybe I'm just proud." She took the job 2 days later. But not before leaving one final mark on the community she had helped liberate. With permission from the new HOA leadership and a unanimous vote from residents, Layla arranged to have the old HOA office, the same one where Karen once barked orders and signed off on fraudulent fines, converted into a community resource center. The new sign above the door simply read Resident Hall. Inside were books, free legal pamphlets, financial literacy materials, and a small conference room for neighborhood meetings. But the centerpiece was what Layla quietly installed in the corner: a framed copy of the Constitution, signed on the bottom by every resident who had filed a complaint, been harassed, or stood up to the old regime. Above it was a quote she picked herself: "Power is not given to those who seek control, but to those who defend others from it." She refused a formal dedication or plaque. She didn't want her name on the wall. But people knew. Every time someone stepped into that building, they knew who made it possible. And that, she said, was more than enough. A few weeks later, we hosted a small gathering at our home. Nothing fancy. Just a backyard barbecue, a couple dozen neighbors, and the kind of laughter that had been missing from the street for too long. It wasn't a victory party. It was a fresh start. Glenn showed up with homemade pie. Rita brought a tray of food and a bouquet for Layla. Joe, the retired firefighter, gave a short toast and said simply, "We owe more than thanks to the woman who reminded us what justice actually looks like." Layla accepted it all with quiet grace, never once trying to center herself. She let the community take the spotlight. That was always the point. As the sun went down and the party wound down, Layla stood alone for a moment at the edge of the yard, watching the lights flicker from windows up and down the street. I walked over and put an arm around her. She leaned in slightly and whispered, "I think it's safe now." Not perfect, but safe. I nodded. Safe enough to be human again. She smiled at that. The next morning, she packed her bag and boarded a flight to Washington. The task force orientation was just the beginning. There would be briefings, travel, strategy sessions. She was walking into a bigger storm, but this time with an umbrella forged from experience. And back home, the neighborhood she saved kept moving forward, freer, lighter, and finally aware that silence in the face of corruption only gives it strength. A new flag hung on our porch now. The old one had been torn in the chaos and Layla folded it neatly into a memory box. The new flag flew a little brighter, not because it was newer, but because it flew without fear. And that's what Layla had given us. Not just justice. Not just protection. She gave us the courage to stop being afraid. And every time I looked at that flag, I remembered how one woman's quiet strength brought down a crooked empire, with nothing more than a badge, a plan, and the unshakable belief that no one, not even a homeowners association, was above the law.